Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about 4.6, the money supply, but instead of what happens if we have limited reserves, which is what we've been talking about for the last couple of days with conducting monetary policy through open market operations. We're going to buy bonds, we're going to sell bonds, and that's how we're going to make the money supply bigger or smaller. I think I've already told you that's not really how we do it in the United States. In the United States, we don't operate on a limited funds reserves system or limited reserves banking system. We instead use an ample reserves system. So let's jump into our PowerPoint and we're going to talk about why. This is what we went through last week, where again, the whole point of this, everything that we're trying to get to is to close an output gap. So we can close an output gap by conducting fiscal policy, which is done by Congress, and it's changing government spending or changing taxes in order to boost or decrease aggregate demand to close an output gap. The other side of the coin is monetary policy. And monetary policy is all about monkeying around with interest rates in order to boost aggregate demand or decrease aggregate demand. So there's a little bit more steps involved in getting from the action that the government takes for it to filter through the economy to get to the end result, which is a boost to aggregate demand or a decrease to aggregate demand. But the first half of it was monetary policy, where we talked about changing the reserve requirement, changing the discount rate, or conducting open market operations to change the money supply, to change interest rates. And then those changes in interest rates are what was going to cause the change in aggregate demand. But what we know, so here's that cartoon again, takes us through all the steps that we just talked about. What we know is that that's a lie. That's not how we do it in the United States. And why does the College Board make us learn both? I don't know. Take it up with them. I'm just going to teach you what you need to know for your exam. So, monetary policy in real life in the United States, the reserve requirement in the US banking system is 0% reserve requirement. And so, in actuality, when we conduct open market operations, there's zero impact on interest rates. And so let's talk about why. So I think that this graph paints a pretty good picture for you. So this is the graph that shows the amount of reserves in the US banking system by year. So from 1960 all the way up to 2008, we were pretty consistent that banks were keeping just the absolute bare minimum that was required by law in their required reserves. And what did they do with the rest of their money? They either A, kept it stashed in excess reserves where it made them zero money, or they loaned it out. They took those excess reserves and loaned them out to customers, you and me, when we go to buy a car or we go to buy a house or we go to remodel our house or we go to open a business, they would loan it to us. And what banks were doing, they were being very, 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 very naughty in the early 2000s, and they were loaning out money to anyone with a pulse for them to buy a house. And they were using very irresponsible banking practices and giving loans way beyond what people could afford to pay back. And it came back to bite them in the butt with the housing market crash of 2008. Because if you're loaning people money that they really can't afford, eventually that's going to catch up to us. So, one of the things that they did to try and fix the problem that we had in the Great Recession was give banks a third choice of what to do with their money. Before 2008, their choices were keep it in excess reserves where it earns them $0, or loan it out where it makes interest for them. And even if they made some risky loans, statistically, it came back to their benefit. So they almost always loaned it out. But then we have this huge explosion in the housing market. and banks are collapsing. And so we realized we needed to make some changes. So here's the deal. Prior to 2008, we had less than $50 billion in reserves. And now you can see we peaked around $4,000 trillion, or sorry, 4,000 billion, which means we've got somewhere around $3.5 trillion in reserves. So why? We can use a carrot or we can use a stick. And so the federal government decided to offer a carrot to banks instead of bopping them on the head and saying, you have to keep this much in reserves. They decided to offer a carrot for banks to be more responsible with their reserves. And so here's the deal. Um, the Federal Reserve began to pay interest on reserves that banks store with the Federal Reserve. So now banks have three options. They can keep it in excess reserves where it does nothing for them. No bank is going to pick that. They can loan it out to regular customers, or they can store their money at the Fed and earn interest with the Fed on their reserves. That is zero risk to banks. When banks loan out money, it implies there's some level of risk involved. But when you store your money in reserves at the Fed, there's zero risk to banks. It's a guaranteed return in interest. Now, it's not a huge amount of interest, right? Banks can still make more money by loaning it out, but they can make at least enough interest to incentivize them to keep money stored in reserves so that we don't get ourselves into a situation where banks are crashing because their money that they've loaned out, people are defaulting on their loans, and now we have no money. So here's the deal. Interest on reserves is abbreviated IOR. Side note, you should have a paper that you got out of the basket that has your notes for 4.6 ample reserves. So if you're following along, I'm not making you fill in any little things on your notes. Just follow along with it, and you can see I'm giving you all the stuff that you need. So abbreviations that we need. Interest on reserves, that is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve will pay to commercial banks to hold reserves at the Fed. And that is abbreviated IOR, or interest on reserves. We're going to see this abbreviation multiple times as we go through the ample reserves system. So we need to learn this term, administered rates. Administered rates are interest rates that are directly controlled by the Fed. We are a free market capitalist economy. And so the Federal Reserve and the federal government have some control over the economy, but really the free market and supply and demand control the economy. So, what are the parts of the economy that the Fed directly 100% has control over? One of the things that they have direct and absolute control over is the administered rates. What do I mean when I say rates? I mean interest rates. So, administered rates or administered interest rates. These are interest rates that the Federal Reserve can just wave its magic wand and say, this is the interest rate. There are other interest rates in the banking system that are set and controlled by the free market, by supply and demand. But these two particular rates that we're going to talk about next are the whole key to how monetary policy works in an ample banking system. And it all comes down to, what are these administered rates? So, I think I said this before, but reserves that are stored at the Fed pose zero risk to banks. Therefore, they do not have an incentive to loan out their money if the interest rate they can earn on that loan is less than the interest rate they can earn on reserves. So if I have $100 in my hand, I could store it as reserves and get 2% interest. I could loan it out to someone and earn 1% interest. Why would I loan it out at 1% if I can store it at the Fed in reserves and make 2%? So what's going to happen is we're going to see these two administered rates that we're going to talk about create a range, a buffer, kind of like a top guard and a bottom guard for the federal funds rate. Let's keep going. If you're feeling overwhelmed by vocabulary, you're not alone. The most confusing part about this section is getting all the terminology set in your head. The idea of raising interest rates and lowering interest rates in order to incentivize spending or disincentivize spending, I think we've already gotten there. We've already said, yeah, when interest rates are low, people want to borrow money to spend. When interest rates are high, people don't want to borrow money in order to spend. But getting the specific vocabulary set is what is going to cause some issues for us. So in the ample reserves banking system, which is what we have, um, everything rests on two particular interest rates that are directly controlled by the federal government. Um, you can see where we made the switch from the limited reserve system to the ample reserve system now that we have, shockingly enough, an ample. Yeah, I would say $4 trillion is an ample amount of reserves to have in the banking system. Okay, so monetary policy is done by changing interest on reserves rather than OMO. Do you guys remember what OMO stands for? Open market operations. So in limited reserves, we conduct open market operations and we buy and sell bonds. Buy bonds big, sell bonds small. With ample reserves, everything is all about interest on reserves. So in a limited reserves banking system, banks deposit very few reserves with the central bank, and a very small change to the money supply will dramatically affect interest rates. No, I have another graph we're going to get to. So, if we change the money supply by just a little bit, if there's not that much money floating out there, then a small change in the money supply will show a significant change to interest rates. So the central bank or the Fed will do open market operations, buying and selling bonds in order to manipulate the money supply. But when we have an ample reserves system, banks are depositing trillions of dollars in ample extra reserves with the Fed and earning interest on those reserves. And so buying $1 million worth of treasury bonds, $1 million of treasury bonds compared to $4 trillion in reserves, nobody cares. There's no impact whatsoever on interest rates if we're talking about buying a million, even $10 million worth of treasury bonds. What is $10 million compared to $4 trillion? It's not even a half of a drop in the bucket, right? So we conduct monetary policy by monkeying around with the administered rates. And the two administered rates that are the focus of our attention are IOR. Do you remember what that stands for? IOR stands for interest on reserves, and the discount rate. These are two interest rates that the federal government has 100% control over. And so we call those administered rates. So what the Fed does is they wave their little magic wand and they change their administered rates. And when they change those administered rates, it causes the market to change interest rates like as a domino effect throughout all of the rest of the banking system. Okay, here are three terms that you absolutely positively have to get straight in your head. And just like everything else in economics, one of the things that's super confusing is that many of these terms have two words that mean the same thing. So let's start first with the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is abbreviated the FFR, but it is AKA, also known as the policy rate. So in a test question, if you see policy rate or you see federal funds rate, it's the same thing. It is the exact same thing. That's like saying commander and thief. or the benevolent overlord. It's the same thing, just with a different name. So the federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other when they loan money to each other. So I think we've talked about this before, that sometimes banks get to the end of the day and they don't have enough to meet their required reserves. Well, that's not even the case anymore, but banks borrow money from each other. Banks borrow money from each other all the time. We don't need to get into the whys of it. I think that's overcomplicating the issue. It's simply enough to say banks borrow money from each other. So the interest rate that banks charge when they loan each other money is called the federal funds rate, also known as the policy rate. The free market sets this rate. Supply and demand sets this rate. The Federal Reserve, ironically enough, it's called the federal funds rate, but the federal government has zero control over the federal funds rate. Okay. This is, yeah, well, it is what it is. Next, the discount rate, abbreviated DR. This is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks to borrow money. So banks borrow money all the time for various reasons. They could borrow money from another bank. If they borrow money from another bank, they pay the federal funds rate. They also have the option of borrowing money from the Federal Reserve. If they borrow money from the Federal Reserve, then they are going to pay a different interest rate. It's called the discount rate. And the discount rate is directly controlled by the Federal Reserve. Therefore, it is an administered rate, meaning the Fed administers the cost of this rate. The last abbreviation we need to know, we've already talked about, is IOR, or interest on reserves. This is interest that the Fed pays to banks on the reserves that banks store at the Fed. There's zero risk to the bank for interest on reserves. And again, the Fed directly sets this rate. The Fed can wave its magic wand and decide how much it's going to pay on interest on reserves. And the Fed can wave its little magic wand and decide how much it's going to charge interest when banks borrow money from the Fed. So our two administered rates that we need to focus on are the discount rate and the interest on reserves rate. Okay, what's a bank to do? Sometimes banks have extra money. If banks have extra money, what are they going to do with that money? Okay, they have some choices. Choice number one, store the money as reserves at the Fed and earn interest. That would be IOR, interest on reserves. They also could loan it to other banks. So if they loan it to other banks, then we're dealing with the policy rate, or the FFR, which stands for federal funds rate. Okay. I'm a bank. I've got a lot of extra money. What am I going to do with it? I'm either going to store it as reserves at the Fed, or I'm going to loan it to another bank. I'm a bank and I need money. What's a bank to do? Okay, I could borrow money from another bank. Notice that this and this, same option, just depends on if you're the borrower or the lender. And so again, if you're borrowing money from another bank, if you're a bank loaning to a bank or borrowing from a bank, you pay the FFR, which stands for federal funds rate. They also could pay the policy rate. I'm sorry, that's the two interchangeable terms. Okay. The other choice is to borrow money from the Fed. And if they borrow money from the Fed, they pay the discount rate. Okay. Hold on. Hold on. Hold on. I'm sorry. I have to pause my recording. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. I had to do something I'm sure you don't care about at all, and neither do I. Okay. So we just talked about what's a bank going to do if they need money, or if they need to, or if they have extra money. Here's their choices. So let's look at the beginnings of the reserve market graph. This is the graph of reserves, supply and demand of reserves. So the demand curve for the reserve market is kind of funky looking. It kind of looks like I guess it looks like a backward Z, maybe. Yeah, I would call it like a backward Z. So we have this top boundary that's a straight line, then we have a downward sloping diagonal line, then we continue on with the straight line. And so it is important to note that in this portion of the graph, this would be what works if you have limited reserves in your banking system. But then this portion of the graph is what works if you have ample reserves in your banking system. So all of this demand for reserves, it just depends on how your banking system is structured. Well, we have an ample reserves system model. So we function over here in this part of the demand curve where it's already bottomed out and flattened out. Over here is where selling a bond is going to move the interest rates. But over here, selling bonds doesn't make one little piddly difference on our interest rates because we have ample reserves. So we're going to operate over here. All right. I don't care about that. All right. So in a limited reserve system, this is the supply of reserves. When the central bank sells bonds, a shift in the supply causes a significant drop in the interest rates, right? If we have limited reserves, this works, but we don't have limited reserves. So that doesn't work for us. Our supply curve is way over here on the bottom flattened out portion of this graph. So let's look at all the pieces of this graph. On the y-axis, you have the FFR, which stands for federal funds rate. That is what is being represented here. You could also call it the policy rate. It is important to note the College Board in their sample released graphs, they call it the policy rate. In all of their labeling, they refer to it with a PR as a policy rate. So what are we going to call it? We're going to call it PR for a policy rate. However, as you've already experienced, you might come across a multiple choice question where they refer to it as the federal funds rate. Okay, no big deal. We know what that means. We know federal funds rate, policy rate is the same thing. Okay, also represented on this graph, the the top boundary of the demand curve reflects the discount rate. What's the discount rate? If only I gave you a paper that had the definitions of it on it. The discount rate is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks when banks borrow money from the Fed. That's the discount rate. Okay. Then down here at the bottom of this graph, the bottom boundary of the demand curve is the interest on reserves rate. So we have like a cap, like a ceiling and a floor, I think is a good way to think about it. Like the demand curve's got a ceiling and it's got a floor. Okay. So when we have ample reserves, buying and selling bonds and shifting the supply has absolutely zero impact on interest rates. So we need to do something different. Instead, what we do, so here's the part of the graph I really want you to see. The top or the ceiling of the demand curve is set by the discount rate. The floor of the demand curve is set by the interest on reserves rate. Remember that the discount rate and the interest on reserves rate are administered rates. That means who has total control over those two interest rates? The Federal Reserve has total and complete control. They are administered by the Fed. They set the rate directly. They wave their magic wand. So if the Federal Reserve wants to raise the discount rate or raise interest on reserves, they just do it. Do it, do it, do it. If they want to raise or lower either of those two rates, they just declare it to be so. And then it happens. And so, how do we conduct monetary policy? If we want interest rates lower, if the Fed says we need lower interest rates, side note, Why would we want lower interest rates? Question mark. What is happening in the economy if we want interest rates to be low? We probably have some sort of negative output gap, and we need to encourage spending. We need to incentivize spending so that we can shift aggregate demand to the right and close a negative output gap. So if we want lower interest rates, the way the Fed does it now is they wave their little wand and they say interest rates lowered, boom. Because most of the time, banks are not borrowing from the Fed. They are borrowing from each other. So the range of interest rates falls between these two numbers right here. It is very complicated, overly complex, and you could take an entire semester course just on this and still not have a full understanding on it. But for our watered down purposes for your AP exam, if we want lower interest rates and we have an ample reserves system, then all the Fed does is lower the discount rate and lower interest on reserves rate. Let me turn on my little pen. What would that look like on your graph? It's kind of like cheating. You draw your little backward Z. So our graph is all set up. And then you come here and you say, okay, let's lower this down. And you drop it down. And then you come over here and you kind of extend the line a bit and then draw your line. And then draw a downward arrow. And then this would be demand 1. And then we would call this demand 2. And so where did our policy rate end up? Before, the policy rate is always going to be on the bottom flattened out part of the demand curve. So when you draw your original graph, wherever the bottom flat part of your graph is, you're going to go all the way across. And then you're going to put a PR1, a policy rate 1, because remember on the y-axis, we are labeling policy rate. So if we're dropping interest rates, now we just go here's our new lower rate. Drop it down, and we're going to call this PR2. I actually think in the long run, this is easier. We want interest rates lower, great, lower the rates. We want interest rates higher, great, raise the rates. None of this buy bonds to shift this money supply to shift the rates. No, just lower the rates or raise the rates. The question is which rates. So we have to be really specific in our answer that we want to change the administered rates. The only interest rates that the Fed can just wave its wand and change are its administered rates. What are its two administered rates? The discount rate, and then this here on the bottom is where the interest on reserves rate is. So we changed the discount rate and the interest on reserves rate. We want lower interest rates, great, drop the rates. Drop the discount rate, drop the interest on reserves rate. If we want higher interest rates, we just do the opposite of that. Clear my drawing. All right. Here. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, and they already had a graph for it. I didn't have to draw it. It's fine. But this is going the opposite direction. If we want to raise interest rates, why would we want to raise interest rates? Question mark. Well, if the economy is overheating, we need to take money out of the economy. We need to cool off the economy. We need to contract the economy. We have a positive output gap, and we need to shift aggregate demand to the left to close that positive output gap. And so the way that we decrease aggregate demand is by disincentivizing spending. When interest rates are high, people are less likely to make big purchases. Just ask Miss Thies. I was trying to buy a car this weekend and it made me want to cry because interest rates are so high. I don't want to buy a car. It's too expensive. So if we need to close a positive output gap, how can the Fed do it in an ample reserves system? They just raise their administered rates. What are their administered rates, Miss Thies? Question mark. Oh, funny you should ask. The discount rate and the interest on reserves rate. So when we raise those up, what happens to the policy rate? The policy rate goes up when we raise the administered rates. What happens when we lower the administered rates? Well, then the opposite would happen and the policy rate would drop. Hello. Oh, sorry. Okay. Wait, what do I have? Nope, I don't want that. Okay, let's practice. Find a scratch little sheet of paper. Let's practice drawing this graph one time, and then I promise we'll be done. All right. So we're going to start by drawing our axis. We're going to call this PR for policy rate. We're going to call this QR for quantity of reserves. Now we're going to draw our backward Z. Straight line, sideways diagonal, and then continue on with our straight line. All right. This is the demand for reserves. Then we need to drop in, I should have drawn that a little bit farther over. See, even I need to practice drawing this graph. Okay, let's draw our x-axis a little bit longer. Okay, so this is quantity of reserves. So now we need to drop in the supply curve, and it is still a vertical line because the Federal Reserve still directly controls. So we've got nope, let me try again. We've got supply of reserves, straight line. Okay. Now, where do I put my equilibrium point? I'm going to put a little dash over here. We're going to label this DR for the discount rate because the discount rate represents the top boundary of our demand curve. This dashed line, we're going to label interest on reserves. And then we're going to call this policy rate number 1. And then this is excuse me, quantity reserves 1. If we want to lower the rates, we just draw a new little arm, extend the line, draw a new little arm, and then show it dropping down. We have to label demand for reserves. This is 1, and this is 2. And then we draw a new equilibrium point over here. We call it policy rate number 2. You could draw it the opposite direction if you wanted to. Guess what? When I come back on Tuesday, we want to draw it a lot. So one time I think is enough. Okay, clear that out. Clear my drawing. Stop that. Stop share. That's enough. This is our first go round. Tomorrow we're going to talk about it some more. I am positive you will have questions, but I just wanted you to see it, absorb it, think about it a little bit, and then we'll do it some more tomorrow. Have a lovely day.